I'm a big fan of the Asian Boss YouTube channel, but on this video I'm going to speak about why you should take some of the things on that channel with a pinch of salt, especially when it comes to finances and managing your finances as an expat. Now before doing that, go over to adamfire.com, especially if you're an expat or a high net worth individual, and see how I can help you. Now I've been living the lifestyle myself for 13 years now, and on this video I'm going to speak about what I wish I would have known when I came overseas 13 years ago, and it's going to tie in to the Asian Boss channel. I watched a video 1 or 2 days ago, and it was speaking about foreigners living in Japan, how much money they can earn and things like that. And what was interesting about the people who were speaking is, like everywhere in the world, they were very much generalizing based on their own experience. So I'll give you an example. There was one lady, I think she was from Colombia or some Latin American country, who was saying she thinks the best paid people in Japan are engineers who are earning 2 or 3 times more than she is. Then later on in the video, there was a guy from the United States working in the IT industry, and he was earning like 8 or 10 times more than she was, and more than her engineer friends. And this kind of brings me to the first point about why you should be careful about this kind of content, and that's that the vast majority of people will generalize based on their personal experience, because birds of a feather tend to flock together, and that kind of creates a bias. If you think about it, most executives will tend to hang out with other executives, most teachers with other teachers, most engineers with other engineers, but sometimes there will be people in your network who are different to you. But if you just focus on channels like this, they'll say certain things that are misleading. It's not the fault of the channel, it's just that naturally if you stop foreigners on the street, those people are going to generalize based on their own experience, apart from a few people who will be more analytical and look at the statistics in general, or they will know a wide range of people in many sectors. So take Japan as an example. The best paying foreigners, just like anywhere in the world, and by the way, I lived in Japan for quite a number of years, are people who have their own businesses. That could be their own businesses in Japan or internationally, because they just want to live in Japan. Second of all, it's people who are expats who are on short-term contracts. So for example, Carlos Ghosn would be an example of that, right? He was paid millions before his ill-fated trip away from Japan per year, and there are executive and CEOs in Japan, but if you go a step below that, there's plenty of expats being paid $1 million or $500,000 packages and so on. It's then when you get below that you're talking about, you know, people on good salaries like the guy in IT and so on and so forth. So the point is, hardly anyone on the video mentioned that. Well, no one in fact mentioned that, even though it's an obvious thing. And in addition to that, what nobody mentioned is, in the last 5 or 10 years, there's been a huge trend that's happening all around the world, not just in Japan, but all around the world. And that's the whole living remotely thing. I've been doing it now for 6 years, where I've had an online business now for 6 years, and I was self-employed before that. So de facto, I kind of was half the way to having my own business before I set up my own business 6 years ago. And now I can live all around the world. And I have people working for me who can live all around the world. So I'll give you an example. 2 of my members of staff are now living in Southeast Asia. One of those members of staff is thinking about living in Japan or South Korea or Taiwan. And I've said to him, he'll have to sort out his own visa, but he's paid in dollars, and you know, there's digital nomad visas now, and you know, he can go through that process if he wants to. But the point is, regardless of whether he does or he doesn't, there are quite a few people as well who are paid really good salaries as digital nomads. Like, they have jobs in Silicon Valley and they ask their employer, can I work overseas? I can remember even going back to 2013 and 14, I met a gentleman in Cambodia who was making $90 to $100 an hour back then, and he asked his employer if he could live and work in Cambodia, and they said yes. So how is this linked to the video again? Well, the video was talking about things like, oh, you should learn Japanese and you should learn this skill and that skill, but they're forgetting the obvious thing. Ultimately, whether you're living in the UK or Japan or Singapore or whatever, The best way for you to make money as an expat is to learn skills that don't depend on language per se, but are applicable all around the world. So for example, that YouTuber who's making millions of dollars a year or hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, all they need to do is get a visa, whether that's an entrepreneur's visa or a creator's visa or a digital nomad visa or a spousal visa, and they need to sort out their taxes and get things compliant, but they can go all around the world. Entrepreneur who has their own business, within reason, they can go all around the world. Again, I've had to sort out so many visas myself in the last few years, but again, for me to move is fairly simple. Yes, I need to speak to lawyers and accountants and so on and get the structuring right, but I can move. The point is, if you get good at something, which you can do online, at home, increasingly it's getting easier and easier to move to so many countries around the world. Just type in digital nomad visa and a country after that, like Romania or Japan or whatever it is, and you'll see that most countries have digital nomad visas now. They have entrepreneur's visa. I think some have creators visas. So you don't have to think, oh, I want to go and live in China, so I've got to learn Chinese and become a worker in a Chinese company, or I want to go to Japan, so I have to learn Japanese. Now, of course, socially speaking, it's good to know the language. When I was living in China, I tried very hard to at least learn good spoken and listening when it came to Chinese. I didn't always succeed quickly, but after 3 or 4 years there, I was pretty reasonable, even though it was very hard for me to learn. I'm not saying socially you shouldn't try, but the point I'm making is a lot of the people on the Asian Boss YouTube channel, they're often giving quite outdated advice because they're basing it on their own personal experience, and the world has moved on since they came overseas in many cases, or they're just not aware about the opportunity. So they're saying learn Japanese or do this or do that, when I would say if you want to earn good money as an expat or a foreigner living overseas, the best two routes are either get a job in your home country with a multinational company or a company that actually has an office overseas. That's the first route because that's easy, right? If you're working with HSBC in the UK, you can ask for a transfer or apply to HSBC Hong Kong or whatever, or PwC or whatever it is. That's one route, be an expat on a short-term, lucrative 2 or 3, 4 year contract. The second good route is to actually set up a business which can be done online, remotely, and from pretty much anywhere in the world, as long as you've got a Wi-Fi connection, and then work out how to get that digital nomad visa or how to get that investor's visa or golden visa or entrepreneur's visa. Those are the two best ways for most people to actually make good money. And then the third way, which again wasn't spoken about on the channel, is to be paid by performance and on performance and not for your time. Now, what do I mean by that? Whether it's Tokyo, whether it's Dubai or Qatar or whatever, if you're a real estate agent, if you're somebody who's getting paid based on commission or performance, what will happen is 80 or 90% of people will fail, 10% of people might do okay, but then decide it's not for them, they'll make decent money, maybe 5% of people will make pretty good money, and then the other 5% will make great money, and the top 1% will become extremely rich at doing that. So that's another person who you can actually find making really good money in Japan, and for that matter globally. I met so many people in Japan who were doing things like recruitment or real estate sales or something which was based on performance, and oftentimes they didn't speak Japanese well because they were targeting foreign clients, and a small number of them actually succeeded. So those three routes, getting paid on performance, being an expat on a short-term 2 or 3 year contract, and for that matter, just doing a remote online business, I would say that is the best way of earning good money as an expat. In comparison, going to a language school, trying to be then a normal worker in a foreign country and then working your way up. It can work for some people, but overall, it is not, I don't think, a good way of making money as an expat. Because also another thing you've got to remember is even if it works for you, if you go to a Japan, for example, and you learn great Japanese and you actually get a good job paying well, you can't take that skill to Korea or China or another country because you're dependent on that skill which is only applicable to one country. In comparison, if you've got relatively rich in Japan or China or whatever from a skill like being paid on performance, which depends on sales skills often, or for that matter, you've been a successful YouTuber in America and then you've came to Japan. If you went to Japan in that situation and you don't like it, there's nothing stopping you moving to another country. So I think that's the main issue I have with these kind of street interviews. They're speaking to people often who are generalizing based on their own situation, and often the people who are commenting are therefore commenting in a very limited, slightly narrow-minded way. And otherwise, I didn't hear many people say, oh, in my situation and for people like me, this is what I've seen. But I do know there are certain people like expats on lucrative 2 or 3 year contracts. That's not me, but I have heard of them and I have seen them. Or I do understand there are increasingly a number of digital nomads and creators, YouTubers, entrepreneurs, online business owners. That's not me, but I'm aware they exist in Japan. Nobody said that. They were all generalizing on their situation. So when you go abroad, even though it might seem sensible to look at YouTube channels and so on, and it is, I would always look at a wide range of different channels and focus on people who have got a wide perspective, not people who are just generalizing based on their experience. Lastly, another thing I will say, which wasn't touched on the video, is you've got to compare apples with apples, not apples with pears. So when it comes to back home, most people are paying into a mortgage and they're doing something like a 401k if you're American, auto-enrollment for a pension if you're British, or the Australians have superannuation. So most people in advanced countries, if you stay and stick to the tried and tested, i.e. living in your own country, by the time you're 55, 60, 65 or 70, you will usually be fairly comfortable, even if you didn't have a lot of money in your 20s, 30s or 40s, because you would have paid off your mortgage, you would have engaged in auto-enrollment or whatever it is. And that's why in the UK, for example, don't get me wrong, there is pensioner poverty and so on, but most middle-aged people actually are more comfortable than most people in their 20s or 30s or even 40s. In comparison, when you go abroad, probably you're not going to feel the same social pressure to pay into a mortgage because it's not as familiar to you. You're not going to feel like, oh, I need to buy a Colombian property or a Japanese property. Likewise, you're probably not going to have something like auto-enrollment. And if you go down the entrepreneurial route or even getting paid on performance route, then often it's not going to come for pension. So one of the big things that the video didn't speak about as well, I think, is if you're going to go abroad, always remember you are going to have to actually save and invest more than people back home to get the same lifestyle. So back home, most financial advisors will say, oh, you need to save and invest 10% of your income for retirement. But that's factoring in that you're going to have a mortgage, you're probably going to do auto-enrollment or a 401k. So if you're abroad, you should be looking to be much more aggressive when it comes to your saving and investing plans if you can afford it, because I've lost count of a number of older clients who came to me in their late 40s, 50s and 60s and said, Adam, I wish I'd contacted someone like you before. Just started small when I was in my 20s or 30s. So I think that's another thing you've got to factor into the equation if you're going to move abroad. It's very easy to move abroad, spend whatever's come in, and then regret it later on. In fact, I saw a BBC article that said that the average British person leaves Dubai, believe it or not, even though it's a very low tax place, with less money than they first came to Dubai with. And a lot of those people have good jobs, but they just get caught up in the lifestyle. Singapore too, where you have this kind of lifestyle, what I call the expat lifestyle. So definitely if you're moving abroad and you're looking at it from a financial point of view, you should also factor in that aspect as well.
Anyways, I'm very, very pleased and positive to say that I believe I've picked the right one. The results in the last couple of years have overreached my expectations by far, and I see no reason why it should not continue. Of course, I can highly recommend him as your financial advisor for now and for the future, because hesitating is missing out.
Obviously, the best result in market right now is Adam.